Ghazali wrote the Maqasid. It's basically based on one of the books of Ibn Sina. He took a book of Ibn Sina and he basically wrote Philosophy for Dummies. Literally, if it was published today, it would be called Philosophy for Dummies. And the scholars actually censured Imam al-Ghazali for doing it because they said he made philosophy accessible to a much larger audience, because Ibn Sina is very abstruse, he's difficult to understand, whereas Ghazali was very clear in his exposition. And so they argued that he's done a grave disservice by writing this book. But what al-Ghazali did, he wrote Maqasid al-Falasifa, which is the aims or the intentions of the philosophers, and he was neutral. He just presented peripatetic philosophy, this is what they say, and all the peripatetics looked at it and said, you've done a marvelous job. Once they said that, okay, in other words, I understand your philosophy. Absolutely, it's a remarkable work of incredible clarity. You've made very difficult thought easy to understand. Then he wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. Now we have imams that have no training in microbiology, and they write books on why evolution is not true. Right? Write a book on evolutionary biology that's recognized by evolutionary, and then follow that up with why you don't think. This is part of the problem with our civilization. It's become a very simplistic civilization. Its approach to problems is very simplistic. And this is not to say that everybody should become a metaphysician. On the contrary, there's not a lot of people that can actually do the work. It's difficult work. But if you don't have those people, then you have a major problem, because you lose the intellectual defenders of your faith. You lose the intellectual defender. And then the defense becomes either fanaticism or, even worse, violence, because fanaticism often leads to violence. When you have defenders of the faith, intellectuals, the other thing that you lose is you lose the intelligent members of your community, because they have questions and they don't find answers for those questions. The world is a very troubling place, and if you don't think so, I don't know what planet you're on. But the world is a very troubling place. And to try to understand what the world is, what our place in the world is, to try to understand these things is very difficult. And for some people that are blessed with pure faith, a very simple faith, what Imam al-Razi called Imam al-Ajaiz, the faith of old women. You know, there's a famous story where he was walking with a lot of his students, dozens of them, and an old woman asked one of the students who was the man, and she, don't you know that's Fakhruddin al-Razi? He has 70 proofs for the existence of God. And she said, why would he need 70 proofs? He must have 70 doubts. And when Razi heard that, he said, you should have the faith of old women. You know, that's real faith. And so it's very beautiful, the faith of old women. That's a beautiful faith. You know, we call them, I grew up in the Orthodox Church, the yayas. You know, they were always in the black. And they were always the first ones at church, the last ones to leave. The men usually sat outside smoking cigarettes, waiting for the mass to get over. But those women, and they've kept Islam alive. You know, people like Sayyid Mubin's mother in our region, who's taught so many children the Fatiha. You know, these women that have this incredible, remarkable faith, a deeply rooted faith. But that faith, believe it or not, can easily be lost. Not with that generation, but with the generation that comes from that generation. Because that generation was a generation that grew up in a different time. And so we're losing those people. And that's why it's so important, because when we lose our intellectual foundations, then unfortunately the devotional foundations often follow. And finally, in conclusion, this book was really, it's called Aqidah Nisafiyya. This book was the book that was studied in the later Muslim colleges, and usually with a commentary by Sa'duddin al-Taftazani, one of the great intellectual giants of our tradition. And to give myself and the students some hope, he was actually considered very, very stupid when he was in the madrasa, and he had just an opening and suddenly became extraordinarily brilliant, and they attribute it to his sincerity. But and that's why we don't really believe in IQ tests, and we don't believe in, even now we know that these things are plastic, that the brain's plastic. We believe in al-Fattah. is one of the names of God, is the opener. But God can give you openings. He can open your heart. Literally a flowering of the heart can happen. People can have intellectual awakenings, just like they have sexual awakenings, emotional awakenings. They can have intellectual awakenings. They can have spiritual awakenings. And in our tradition, an intellectual awakening is a spiritual awakening, because intellect and spirit are not separate. That the mind itself is immaterial. The mind is a spiritual phenomenon. That's why really what's happening right now is a spiritual experience. It's just we're veiled to it. But consciousness itself is a spirit. People always say, I want to have a spiritual experience. You are having a spiritual experience. It's called being conscious. What you have to do is wake up to it. And that's why you're already there. You just have to realize that you're already there. But this book, which is a truncated summary of a vast metaphysical tradition. And at the later period, they were no longer studying that tradition. They were studying the fruits of that tradition. And that's why so many of our scholars that have studied don't really grasp the underlying foundations of this, because they did not get the tools to do that. And it's one of the major problems. And everything comes out of that. In other words, the metaphysical foundation of your tradition is going to inform your ethics, your economics, and your politics. Muslims never produced a Machiavelli. All of our political literature is ethical. We never produced a Machiavelli. Muslims no longer have serious ethical philosophers, and so we're in crisis there, which is why you can have scholars defending suicide bombing, because they don't understand the implications of what suicide bombing actually means, right? What it means ethically, morally. The idea of opening the door of suicide, one of the gravest sins, a sin against the gift of life, opening up the door of suicide to depressed people, to people that just want to check out of the planet. There's a lot of them around. Some of them, the only thing that's keeping them here is their faith. So you open up the door within the faith, and suddenly, who wants to hang around here? Right? Anyway, we're happy to see Dr. Mahan back in the corridors, and thank Sister Marianne Farina, who's been such an incredible support. I truly believe that for us as a Muslim community, if we're going to have a future in this country, it has to be with a serious alliance with the other religious communities in this country, which includes the Catholic community. It's probably the closest community to us in terms of just tradition and a lot of our values. With the evangelical community that finds Islam a demonic religion, an odious religion. I was in Abu Dhabi, and we had an event with 10 evangelical rabbis, 10 rabbis, 10 evangelical ministers, and 10 imams. And the evangelical ministers, it was just amazing, the breakthroughs that they had. They spent 3 days in workshops. There was no lectures. It was sitting down. They were honest with each other. What you feel about our religion. The Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians sat down and had a conversation. And the outcome was really life-transforming for the people that were involved in it, including myself. And so it can happen. Convivencia, the idea of conviviality, of living together. This has happened in the past. It's happened within the Christian community. It's happened within the Muslim community. And it's happened within the Jewish community. All three of us have lived together. The Muslims have lived with Hindus. They've lived with Buddhists. They've lived with Zoroastrians. They've lived with Catholics, Orthodox, and all of the other iterations of Christianity. And it's a checkered history, undeniably. There's good and bad in it on all sides because we're human. But there are really beautiful, bright spots. And that's what we need to look at and try to make that real here. Thank you.